So I am really pleased to have Maddie Krasno here. She is a former primate lab worker turned passionate advocate, and she will be sharing her passionate journey from lab to leading a movement for transparency and compassion in science. She has been featured in the Washington Post for her groundbreaking free speech lawsuits. I'm going to post a link to that in the chat once I'm done reading all this. Against the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the National Institutes of Health. Maddie has shed light on the ethical challenges of animal research, and she is the executive director of Justify, which is a pioneer nonprofit. And she champions a vision of advancing science without human or animal suffering by creating a safe space for current and former lab workers to share their stories and drive meaningful change. And before Maddie begins, I just want to say a few words about why I feel that Maddie and Justify, or what they're doing, are so important, and why I really felt like this is an important presentation to have. I have been an animal rights activist for 25 years-ish, and I've been following and fighting against experimenting on animals in labs for about 20 of those years. It's a significant interest to me for a variety of reasons. And I've learned that using non-human animals to study human diseases and conditions is not only cruel, but bad science and a waste of money and lives. But before I started down that activist path, I almost worked with animals in labs myself. The psychology department of the college that I went to had primates that they were doing behavioral research on, and they had a job opening to clean their cages and other such, work at that level. I applied thinking that it would be fun to work with primates. I did not get the job, but if I had, I can imagine that the living conditions of those primates was probably a lot worse than what I had in mind. And I probably would have felt like I needed to stay and make sure that they got the best care. I don't know what I would do because, again, it went down a different path. And I'd like us to remember that many of the people that work with animals in labs take those kinds of positions not really having a full picture of what it entails, just like myself. And the folks can feel pressured to keep working there for a variety of reasons, whether it's because they feel like they can help animals, or they need class credit, or it's part of their ongoing education. The lab animal industry is seeped in old ways of thinking, and those that don't agree with it eventually leave or find ways to deal with or excuse what's happening. And those that stay are part of this bad system, not bad people. And if we condemn individual participants instead of the system as a whole, we will not be successful in ending animal experimentation. So I'm very thankful that animal lab workers have an organization like Justify to give them support and help deal with what they have seen. And it's important because being supported and being part of a community helps people speak out. And so without further ado, please take it away, Maddie.
Thank you so much. That is by far the best introduction that I or Justify has ever received. And you definitely covered some of what I'll be talking about. But yeah, so thank you, everyone. I am going to be talking about empowering animal lab workers to share their stories. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Justify, this organization that is relatively new, but taking off, why it exists, what we are setting out to do. So, as many of you probably know, the animal research industry operates within a culture of secrecy, fear, and ethical conflict. Lab workers are, as just mentioned, often drawn to the field because, it interests them to work with animals. They like animals. They believe that what they are setting out to do might help human health, progress human health. So the reality, though, is that many people end up experiencing moral injury, burnout, and psychological distress as a result of getting involved in the animal research industry. But this isn't widely advertised. Some of us can kind of jump to this conclusion that the industry is traumatic, but many people don't realize that before getting involved. Now, Justify, this organization that I co-founded and am now the executive director of, we are setting out to provide a safe space, a supportive space for current and former animal lab professionals to share their experiences and advocate for science without human or animal suffering. And what's really cool about Justify is it's the only organization of its kind that's working to gather and, heal individuals from this industry and also help them to advocate for science without suffering. As former lab workers who have faced the emotional toll of this work, the individuals who are behind it, me and my two co-founders, and who are now on the board, along with Dr. John Gluck, who some of you may be familiar with, and I'll mention his book later on. We really want to ensure that everyone who is in the scientific world, whether they're already involved or considering it, feels informed, supported, and empowered to choose a path rooted in kindness and empathy. So we operate based on three key assumptions, and those assumptions are that transparency leads to change, that empowered lab workers drive progress, and that dialogue should replace division, which is probably the third one is probably the most controversial, and I'll get into that a little more. But I kind of wanted to preface this presentation with that. And also share that dialogue doesn't mean agreeing on everything. It means being willing to listen, learn, and work towards a solution together. The shift away from animal experimentation is not going to come from conflict alone, but from courageous conversations and coalitions that are rooted in empathy and transparency. Now, as I go through this presentation, I'm going to share some points that are probably going to upset some people. And it's meant to get us thinking. And I don't expect everyone to agree with everything that I say or to immediately sort of be on board, but I am asking that you are open to what I am saying. So one of those things is, as kind of previously mentioned, that people enter this industry oftentimes with good intentions. Many lab workers care deeply about the animals, as well as humans. And, over time, we've been told that humans benefit from animal research, and there have been things that have benefited humankind. That doesn't necessarily justify what's taking place or what has taken place, but it is a reality that we have to, be aware of. So people often enter this field hoping to make a difference, not to cause harm, whether that's a difference for humans or a difference for the animals in the labs. Systemic forces uphold animal research. So there's a lot of factors, and I'm not going to deep dive into them, but things like the publish or perish culture, where that kind of keeps the animal research industry going, minimal legal oversight, things like the Animal Welfare Act or IACUCs that, are meant to sort of look out for animals, look out for the research itself, and unfortunately are minimal. Of course, funding biases, which is a very interesting thing, but there are biases towards funding animal research as opposed to non-animal research. So who's involved in this industry? I share this slide just to kind of show how pervasive it actually is, because I think at least I know I had this idea that it was kind of this like tiny little sector that, like, if you want to be a doctor or something, or a psychologist, that's where animal research is. But in reality, a lot of people are getting involved in animal research for a lot of different reasons. Veterinary sciences, biomedical sciences, of course, agricultural sciences, the agricultural industry, factory farming is using animal research to kind of bolster that industry. There's a lot that is taking place. And so there's a lot of different kind of fields that ultimately are funneling people into this industry. Whoops. Hello. Okay. So that brings me to my story. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience as I am a former primate lab worker. and to kind of illustrate where I'm coming from and also how Justify came to be, because it really did come from my own experience of working in a lab and connecting with other individuals who had worked in labs and realizing the comfort and the power in talking to each other. So this is little Maddie with my bird, Sydney, who is no longer with me, but I was very in love with him. Um, so how did I get involved in working in a primate research lab? It was actually because I looked up to this woman here, Jane Goodall, and her work with chimpanzees. So I was really in awe of Jane, and I was interested in working in primate conservation too. And what ended up happening is that during college, I enrolled in a class called Animal Behavior, the Primates. It's all about the different primate species, what they're like in the wild. I have very little memory of it actually talking much about animal research, like in labs, as opposed to what's taking place out in the world where they are wild. But I say this because the professor, the person who taught the course, was actually the director of the lab that I went on to work in. So the person who was in charge of Harlow Primate Lab is actually the person who inspired me to sort of really follow my dreams of working in primate conservation and realizing that, you know, one of the ways to sort of get a foot in the door would be to, you know, become a caretaker at the lab on campus, because there were almost 2,000 monkeys on campus at Madison. And the thing is that I didn't, you know, I truly did not know much about animal research in terms of what is going on in laboratories. Um, you know, I'd heard bits and pieces. I knew who Harry Harlow was because that is the lab that I went on to work in. Um, but at that time, you know, Harlow had passed, and I, you know, read what I'm sure many people have been exposed to, which is that the animals are treated really well. The research is life-saving. It needs to exist, or we won't have yada yada yada. And so in my head, I just thought, you know what, like caring for these animals will be an important step in my career, and I love monkeys. Let's do it. And I really didn't know much of what I was getting myself into. I was hired to be a student caretaker my sophomore year of college. And just to give you a timeline here, so I worked in the lab from 2011 to 2013. So it has now been over a decade. But if you kind of circle back to that time, you know, social media was super early on. So, you know, these days I feel like we're kind of some of, you know, if we're in the animal circle, we're bombarded with kind of information and imagery from the animal research industry. I wasn't exposed to any of that. So this was my exposure. Um, and it set in pretty quickly, this kind of realization that I didn't like what was taking place. It made me really sad to see these animals like this day in and day out. I was a part-time caretaker, so as a student, during the week, I would kind of do things like um, enrichment prep, so cutting up slices of apples and handing those out, stuffing popcorn and other cereal into like these plastic devices that we would hang on their cages, and it would take them like 10 minutes to go through, but it gave them something to do. A lot of dishes, cleaning, things like that. And then on the weekends, two of us students were responsible for taking care of the 500 plus monkeys that were in this facility. Madison has two labs. There's Harlow Primate Lab, and then the lab next door is called the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center. They fall under the same umbrella, but that lab is slightly bigger. It has, I believe, like over 1,000 monkeys. So the lab I was in, as I said, had over 500 monkeys, and two of us on the weekends were responsible for coming in, doing health checks. So that was like carrying a flashlight around because a lot of these rooms were not well lit, and checking to see how individuals were, looking for blood if anyone was injured, also looking for blood to see if someone was menstruating because it was a breeding facility. They were often putting females in with males, to have them breed. And this was actually one of the more traumatic experiences because oftentimes, our role was to listen, and would be listening for screaming or things like that because, these females, um, they they often didn't know these males. They might have a chance to get to know them a little bit, but it's not necessarily like they didn't necessarily want to breed, and so um, this was a regular practice, and once the females did become pregnant, they would have their babies, and they'd have them for about 6 to 12 months until they were taken away from them. So it was a, constant cyclical process, so to speak. So as we're kind of going around and doing health checks, we're also giving out any medications for animals who are on medications, or taking them out of their cages if they need like a shot. Um, and then we're also feeding them and checking their water. And then after that, we would be taking a break and calling our supervisor, who was not on site. Again, this was just the two of us students. We're like 20, 21, 22. We call our supervisor, let them know what we saw, ask if there's any, basically find out if there's anything specific they want us to do, if there's advice on certain situations. Assuming everything's good, then we go back and we hose down every room and like the drop pans where the feces and the urine would be. And that would be the morning. And then in the afternoon, one of us would come back and go through all of the rooms, like all 500 plus of the individuals, basically, to check on everybody and give out PM medications. So that was how it went if everything kind of went well. Now, oftentimes something happened because you've got 500 plus monkeys living in barren cages. And uh, so the weekends were really honestly stressful, and oftentimes very upsetting. I mean, there was a time where I in one weekend I came across, so sorry, let me back up for a second. I mentioned the breeding that was taking place. Now, when these animals were bred, sometimes, the reality for these monkeys in the wild is that they learn from each other. They learn how to care for their babies. There's oftentimes like aunting where like others will help out even if it's not their baby. This doesn't take place in these labs because oftentimes they are not in any sort of social group. They might be like in this image you're seeing, there are two adult macaques, and at least one baby. I'm not sure. There may be a second one. It's hard to see. But basically, like that's the extent of social housing for the most part. And so sometimes these individuals, the first time they have a baby, they're sort of like, what do I do with this? And they might reject the baby by leaving them, like instead of holding them, like you see here, if they're not holding their newborn and the newborn's just sort of like on the bottom of the cage, that means that they've rejected them, unfortunately. And these animals are really good moms, but this is, again, a very unnatural situation. So in that case, if we find the baby and the baby is not dead, which has happened, we are basically syringe feeding them until we can cross foster them, introduce them to another mom who just had a baby taken from her because the baby aged out, and then she can raise another baby. So there was one weekend where we had two rejected babies in incubators, and we would come in and syringe feed them. And on one day, I found one of these infants dead, which requires me to then take them and put them in a biohazard bag and into the freezer. And then the next day I came in and one of the babies, the other rejected infant, had a seizure and died in my hands. So 2 days in a row, I had to put infants into a plastic biohazard bag and into a freezer. There was another instance where a macaque was having a prolapse, and I had come back in the afternoon alone, and I had called my supervisor, and my supervisor directed me over the phone how to manually fix the prolapse. So this is the type of care. This is what's going on. There are no veterinarians on property. I mean, they're on call, but you don't know how long it's going to take to have them come. And yeah, so I just kind of wanted to illustrate a little bit of the chaos and what it's like to try to do right by these animals. And before I kind of move past my own experience, I want to tell one more story about an individual named Norm. Now, this is not Norm, this is actually Cornelius. If any of you are familiar with an undercover investigation that was done by PETA a few years ago, Cornelius was one of the individuals that they often talked about. I'm just using his photo because he reminds me of Norm, like this is what Norm looked like. And it's limited imagery from these labs. So Norm was a larger male macaque, and he lived alone, but like in a room with a lot of other individuals. And with Norm, I met him pretty early on in my training. And I was shown with Norm, well, the thing with Norm is that he was pretty unusual. He liked interacting with the humans, and he didn't see us necessarily as, someone who had invoked fear like a lot of the other individuals. And so one of my colleagues had shown me how he would press his own like arm up against the wire like you see here. And then my colleague would groom him through the bars. And of course, this was something we weren't supposed to do, but we did. And then my colleague showed how he put his own like jacketed arm against the bars, and Norm started trying like grooming his arm through the bars. So it just became like clear that like this is what you do with Norm. Whenever I would enter that room, Norm kind of welcomed me into the group. I would groom him, he would groom me. And you can imagine like he lives alone. He can't groom other monkeys. This was his only actual contact, like physical contact with others. There were obviously other monkeys around. He could smell them, he could see them, but the physical contact was this. Now one day Norm was gone. And when I kind of got the courage to ask where he was, I was told that he was put into an alcohol study. And that meant that he was there were some rooms that were like strictly for research studies, and like the caretakers were no longer sort of responsible for those animals. And so I never saw Norm again. And I know that in these studies, they were given basically unlimited amount of alcohol. Like they could just drink as much as they wanted. And the hardest part for me with this is that I still to this day cannot stop thinking about, how Norm in my mind like must have felt some level of betrayal. That, here he is sort of befriending us, we're befriending him, and then, he's basically put in a situation where he can just drink himself to death. And you could imagine in this situation, if this is where you live and it's like the option of sort of like I don't know, alcohol or no alcohol, I can see how they would just choose to keep going. And it really breaks my heart thinking about him and how there was just like nothing we could do. Because this was accepted. It's normalized. You get to do this study because it passed this protocol and you know, that's all I can share of Norm's story because I don't know what happened to him. And I share it because his story deserves to be told, and there's so many other individuals whose stories deserve to be told. And when I went into this experience, I had no idea what this was going to do to me, and I can go on and on about how this is impacting these individuals, and it breaks my heart still to this day. Um, there were individuals there when I worked there that were older than me. So they had spent their entire lives in these cages. I mean, that's more unusual because these animals, for the most part, are going to be killed at some point during the research. And oftentimes that's at a much younger age. So there was something especially haunting looking at an individual who had spent their entire lives in a cage like this. And, I later on came to sort of understand that this was not just traumatic for these individuals, but traumatic for the humans involved, and that trauma kind of uh, sort of started to take over my life a little bit. Um, but I want to make the point that the stories that I tell, generally speaking, are not overly egregious, horrifying stories. Um, and there's a reason for that because I want people to understand that animals suffer outside of the experiments, that their day-to-day life is filled with deprivation and stress and pain. These babies were constantly just like, huddled together in fear. And this is when they're not even being experimented on. It's a life of stress. Um, and I like this quote by Dr. Crystal Heath, who is the executive director of our honor, who says that all animal industries benefit from activist depictions of the worst industry practices. Those in the industry, interns and students just starting in the industry, can look around and believe they're working for a good company and that their colleagues display compassion for the animals that is above and beyond industry standards, simply because they don't see the most egregious industry practices taking place. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't show what's happening when it's happening, but I think it's really important as activists and also as just people who have these stories to share these stories because the industry it needs to be known that just the day to day is simply unjust. So fear keeps people silent. I can say that personally. Lab workers who question the ethics of their work, whether you're in research or in animal care, often fear retaliation, losing their jobs, or being blacklisted. This fear can often prevent people from speaking out or seeking support. I didn't speak out for a long time. I was terrified. Um, I I kind of just shut down and was like, I'm gonna go work in for animal sanctuaries and help animals that way. But ultimately, like I'm just gonna try to forget all of this. And that didn't work well. I ended up I ended up getting diagnosed with PTSD. I was having like really persistent nightmares. I would even have sort of what happens when you dissociate and sort of like I basically something would trigger a memory and I'd go back to the lab and I couldn't get out of it. And what ended up happening is that when I got that diagnosis, I also started connecting with some individuals who I already knew. Well, some who I already knew were speaking out because, like, I came across Dr. John Gluck's book. Again, I will show you that for those who don't know who I'm talking about in this moment. But he was someone who worked as a vivisector, a primate vivisector, and then went on to speak out against it. And connecting with him, connecting with other individuals like my co-founders of Justify, I started to, as much as, like, some of it was hard because it was like it's hard to talk about this. It wasn't like, oh, I'm healed, but there was something healing about it. There was something comforting about talking with people who get it, who understand that some people get involved, a lot of people get involved with good intentions, and that backfires, obviously not just for the animals, but for those involved. And eventually I got bolder and I started to really tell my story, like I'm doing today. And so, as mentioned in the introduction, I have been involved in a couple of lawsuits, and they were based on free speech, on violations of free speech. I am in a current lawsuit against the University of Wisconsin-Madison for censoring me in discussing my experiences in the lab online. Commenting on their social media and trying to have these discussions. I was also a plaintiff on a lawsuit against the NIH, the National Institute of Health. This was along with a friend of mine, Ryan Hartkopf, who is a Madison resident, as well as PETA. And we won this lawsuit. It was very similar to the one that's currently still ongoing with Madison. But basically, the NIH was trying to suppress conversation about animal testing on their social media, which is really wild because they fund so much of the animal research taking place. And so I'll let you guys kind of go on, and you can ask me questions in the Q&A if you want, or read about the lawsuit. But the main thing that I think summarizes this win was said by the court to the NIH, and it was this: to say that comments related to animal testing are categorically off topic when a significant portion of NIH's posts are about research conducted on animals defies common sense. So this was a big win, and a recent win, actually, but the lawsuits were from a few years ago. So again, I have kind of gotten to that point where I am more comfortable speaking out, but that's really not the case for everyone. Institutions, whether it's like universities or these companies, they discourage vulnerability. So academia and research institutions are often suppressing conversations about emotional distress or ethical discomfort. And it can be subtly or overtly penalized. I mean, even in the lab, I knew that if I sort of brought up any discomfort, that I would be labeled an animal activist. I was not an animal activist at that point. I was not an animal rights activist. I did end up going vegetarian while I worked in the lab, but I was an animal lover, and that was kind of the extent of who I was. And even then I knew that, saying too much, you might be labeled in a certain way. And then, if I was afraid that if I, like, wasn't working there anymore, that someone who cared less potentially would take my spot. You feel kind of stuck because you want to help these animals, but you're sort of working in this system that where you realize that there's very little you can really do. And it's becoming more, what's really amazing is just in the last, like, year or two, we're starting to see outlets reporting on the experiences of individuals working in these labs. I was actually quoted in, I think, two or three of these. And that's really, I think, promising to see that there are more individuals who are starting to speak out, or even if it's anonymous, about what it's like to be caring for animals in a situation like this, or even trying to do research and realizing that you're not a fan of what's taking place. And one thing I want to kind of insert into this conversation, because I understand, especially as activists, that it can be really hard to hear someone talk about this, to be a part of this, and to not say, like, you should have just left. How are you doing this? Like, but empathy doesn't have to mean endorsement. Understanding someone's position, empathizing with them does not mean you condone their actions, what they did or are doing. Empathy is a bridge, not a stamp of approval. I know it's easier said than done, but this is one of the things that is really important in helping to encourage people to share what is really happening. Because when we get more of what is happening out there, we have a much better shot at a more just approach to science, one where animals are not being harmed and where human relevant research is really being prioritized. Reddit is a platform that over the years I heard a lot about, but I was never a part of. And recently I've been paying a lot of attention, and it's because this is the platform where it seems people are most comfortable sharing about their experiences in the lab because it is completely anonymous. So, for those of you who are interested in kind of looking more into what discourse is out there, this was a thread that somebody actually shared recently on Twitter, or X, I guess is what it's called now, and that went viral. And I thought that was amazing because it's like, again, bringing this conversation to the forefront is shedding light on animal research in a way that really has not been shown. And this person's story is just one of many. I work with mice and I would rather die than work this job another day. So another point that I want to make is that some activist division can be really counterproductive. The tendency within, some parts of the animal rights movement to dismiss or villainize all people in the industry, even though suffering hurts the cause. Systemic change requires broad coalitions, not purity tests. And the thing is that, we live in an imperfect world that is causing a lot of harm in a lot of different ways. We need to do better at not assuming that the worst of everyone. And I know that is difficult. I'm going to share with you a few quotes that have some of were directed at me in the last couple of weeks. Not this one, this was a while ago. But I want to show you the discourse that is out there, especially on social media, about people who work in labs. And I want you to imagine someone like me from the industry who might be questioning things coming across these comments, and whether that is going to encourage them to speak up or to not. So this one says, animal lab workers can cry me a river. They are sellouts and are going to have to pay for their choices, as all choices have consequences. They better learn to make better and wiser ones that serve the greater good of all, if they're at all concerned about anything other than their measly human existences and their paychecks. Now, are there some people who are just focused on their paychecks? Sure. But is everyone? No. The answer is simply no. Especially after talking with individuals from this industry, that's not it. Especially because lower down on, I'm not talking about the researchers on top, but lower down, especially the animal care teams, they're not paid that well. This isn't about pay. This was said directly to me a couple weeks ago. You think you have PTSD? What do you think the animals go through for human greed? That's all it is. Over 90% of trials fail at human trials, after everything those poor souls went through. Help them by doing so you can heal. I mean, I am, but thank you. That is the only thing that will cleanse your consciousness if it bothers you. I am sorry if you meant well by this, but as I read it, I felt I am supposed to feel sorry for the lab techs instead of the animals, and I won't. This was also said to me. No forgiveness, your turn to suffer now, hope it lasts forever. And these were in response to me sharing bits and pieces of my story and about why Justify, think about like what I'm sharing with you now in this presentation. Suffering isn't a competition. There's no need to compare human and animal suffering in labs. They both matter. And recognizing human trauma doesn't diminish animal pain. It's actually just showing how broken this system is. I understand, like, I mean, to me, what the animals are going through is absolutely horrendous. But the reason that I empathize so deeply with humans involved is because I've been there and I get it. I know what it's like to be a part of this very problematic system. And, I just hope that individuals who historically have struggled to kind of see this, realize that we don't have to pit these two against each other. They're both just showing that things need to change. Now, that being said, a few other things I want to cover. The industry is doing its own work to sort of portray activists, as all activists, as extreme, irrational, dangerous, shutting down opportunities for dialogue, and for sort of realizing that there may be like joint goals here of, improving human health, reducing suffering. And this narrative just like actively discourages lab workers from engaging with activists. There's this whole us versus them mindset. Right here, you are seeing an image. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the Foundation for Biomedical Research, and this is a quote straight from their website, is America's most experienced and trusted and effective nonprofit dedicated to improving human and animal health by promoting public understanding and support for biomedical research. This is a poster that you can get on their website to, hang up in your lab. Some people think that the best way to protect animal life is to make scientists fear for theirs. Violent crime committed in the name of animal rights threatens life-saving medical research. These acts of domestic terrorism divert millions of research dollars into rebuilding labs, adding security, and protecting scientists and their families. Tragically, the ultimate price is paid by the sick and dying waiting for a cure. Okay, so do some activists evoke fear in scientists? Sure. But this, you can see how this is painting this horrible picture of all activists. They also put out an animal research activism report. And this is a very interesting report if anyone wants to dive into it. But I just pulled out some things to also show how people in labs, this is what they're being told and this is what they're being exposed to. And so this is why they also fear activists and are looking at us in a way, and I say us, but like I'm sort of on both, right? Like I'm teetering in both categories a little bit. Anyway, it's telling you things like be on the lookout for unusual behaviors by current employees. So like they're fostering this culture of fear and secrecy. Um, you know, uh some behaviors might be natural, but some might signal the presence of an employee with ulterior motives. Um, so they're basically, freaking people out, making them sort of distrust each other. And that plays out in a sense that like it even keeps people from talking to each other in the lab. I'm going to show you in a minute or two how someone that I worked with in the lab ended up speaking out when I spoke out. And I had no idea when we worked together that this individual was struggling because we didn't talk about that. We just like kind of knew, keep these things to yourself. Another thing in the animal research activism report is about the Cook minutes, basically telling people to not include or limit exposure, not include details that don't absolutely have to be included because you want to limit exposure to FOIA requests, these open record releases. So, they're saying, for example, ensure purpose-bred rats, mice, and birds are not included in your reports because they don't have to be. They're not covered by the Animal Welfare Act, so we don't need to include them. So just don't even include them. Okay. Now I want to contrast. Oops, here we go. Sorry. That poster right here. These are two individuals. They're obviously anonymous here, but these are two individuals who worked in a research lab, and they are discussing their experience with activists. And they say, so Angry Mouse said, one thing I noticed since leaving my lab is the way animal rights activists are talked about. We're sold the story that there are horrible, violent people who hate humans and would hurt us if they could. Since leaving and actually talking to activists, this couldn't be further from the truth. And then Cat Doc responded, I was told the same thing and why we should be so secretive, because they will bend the truth to make a point. None of this is true. It's the industry that maintains secrecy by fear because they know reasonable people would be appalled at how they treat these animals. Keep up the good trouble. So, another thing to keep in mind is that redirecting funds can do more good. If we redirected even a fraction of the funding from animal research to human relevant science and public health solutions, we could alleviate more suffering, both human and animal, starting today. Now, I want to show this. This is from 2009, but I think it's a great example. Ohio State was doing research where they were basically having beagles, I believe, well, forcing some kind of dogs to run on a treadmill until they collapsed from a heart attack. That was the research. PETA was not thrilled, as much of the general public wasn't. And Ohio State put out this message that, PETA and other groups continue to target studies like these, which harass researchers and students. Ultimately, it's slowing the progress of biomedical research and impeding our ability to improve the health of Americans. Now, my question is, are there other ways to improve the health of Americans? We are spending, the US government spends approximately $14 to $16 billion per year on animal experimentation. Imagine, if we spent those billions in a different way. Homes for the unhoused, ensuring everyone has access and can afford healthcare, health insurance, therapy, medications that already exist, supporting teachers in schools, food justice, all of these things. There are other ways to immediately help humans, okay? It doesn't have to necessarily be that way. Something to think about. Animal research isn't delivering as promised, right? There's a widespread but false belief that every animal used in research brings us closer to a cure. In reality, most experiments don't translate to human health. This was a real billboard campaign that took place. Who would you rather see live? This adorable child or this rat? And I'm not even going to comment on it. I am going to read a quote by Dr. Catherine Rowe from Science Advancement and Outreach, a sector of PETA that is made up of actual scientists, people who have worked in research. She said, is it okay to hurt a few mice to benefit millions of humans? That's not the question. The question is it okay to kill tens of millions of animals each year, forcing them to live a life of misery and suffering on the off chance with the slight possibility that this might benefit a human 20 years from now? That's the question, and most people don't realize it. Also, access to treatment is not universal. Even when research may lead to usable medicine, few people can actually afford it or access those treatments. We see that even now. There's plenty of stuff that people cannot access because they can't afford it. So this pipeline from lab to life-saving cure is neither direct nor equitable. So By now, you can probably see that emotional trauma runs deep. Many individuals on both sides, I'm talking about activists as well as people in the labs, are carrying unprocessed grief, guilt, burnout, and moral injury. Um, this can show up as anger, defensiveness, and disengagement. And this can make dialogue, whether it's between individuals in the industry or between the industry and activists, really complicated. Sam is the individual that I mentioned before that actually worked in the lab with me. And I just want to read what Sam had written. So Sam ended up publishing a guest blog published on Rise for Animals website. And at the end of it, Sam wrote, "Thank you for reading. I was inspired to come forward and share my experience because of another University of Wisconsin student and Harlow lab caretaker, Maddie Krasno. Maddie's bravery, despite the attempts by UW-Madison to silence her, made me realize how important it was for me to come forward." Again, we had no idea what the other was experiencing, even though we worked together. And that's what I think is so powerful about Justify and about, helping people to have a place where they can turn to and to share their stories if they are ready and willing. This Vox piece just came out very recently, March 3rd, and this individual wrote to Justify and said, "I just finished reading the Vox article by Celia Ford, and I wanted to take a moment to thank you. Oops, sorry, it's blocking. If it wasn't for you sharing this opportunity and encouraging me, I don't think I would have spoken up, and I'm really grateful that you pushed me to do so. Seeing everything laid out in the article and realizing how many of us share these experiences has been both validating and eye-opening. A central theme of the article was isolation and numbness, but bringing so many voices together to expose the realities of lab animal research helped shine a light on what's often kept in the dark. This was my first time speaking out publicly. I was very nervous, but they did a great job keeping me anonymous. I'm Andrew. Thank you for giving me that extra push. Means a lot, fuels my own fire." Another individual who has recently spoken out and is very inspiring: "To the animals that I brought into this world just to kill, I deeply apologize. I know nothing I can say or do can reverse what I have done to you, but I hope you know that because of you, I have made it my mission to make science cruelty-free." This is a neuroscience PhD candidate. And then this is the quote I like to end presentations with, because as heartbreaking as it is, it also tells me, reminds me exactly why Justify exists and needs to exist. This was anonymously shared with us. "Current worker feeling trapped and unable to leave. My laboratory is chronically short-staffed. We're all working extra shifts to cover all the animal care needed. I'm terrified that bad things will happen if I leave. I really appreciate Justify for helping me realize I'm not alone and giving me hope I can escape this industry." So, final thought, I think it's really important, as hard as it can be, is to try to reject the good versus evil narrative. Painting this issue as black and white erases the complexity of the system, and it really it makes it difficult for us to move away from animal research. We have to realize that there are shared goals that can come about, especially if we are to invite conversation as opposed to shut it down. Um, Recommended reading really quick. In the middle is Dr. John Gluck's book, the one I kept mentioning. He is on the board of Justify. This book is incredible. It's really why I started publicly speaking out. Also, Richard Miller, who worked in the industry, wrote this amazing book, The Rise and Fall of Animal Experimentation. And then there's Rat Trap. There's so much, but these are just a few. Some recommended resources for those who might be interested in learning more about what others are doing to sort of combat these issues, whether it's like what exists in terms of non-animal research. These are all great resources. And that is it. And I realize I went to the very end, but for those of you who want to stick around, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation. As I mentioned, feel it's very important that people are aware. And I realized I neglected to say who I was at the beginning of this. Not that it matters very much. My name is Rachel. And, as I mentioned, I have been very interested in animal research for a long time, and I attend the University of Washington IACUC meetings. And, I see just how much they blame any error on individuals. They don't ask, well, why was the water not hooked up, or whatever happened. It's always just blaming the individuals and not the system. So it's just reiterating basically what you what you're saying.
Yeah, it's like we're set up to fail in a way. You like,
Yes.
how can you properly care? How can two college students properly care for 500 plus monkeys? Like that's not possible. And it's not to say there aren't more caretakers during the week, but 500 monkeys, and then we talk about thousands of mice. It's yeah, it's
The
set up.
University of Washington, like I'm sure any lab that has mice has them literally like stacked in little plastic boxes on top of each other, and they expect one person to make sure that they all have food or water.
Right.
Um,
Yeah,
Very unfair.
it is. It's wild.
So there's a question about how is Justify different from our honor.
Yeah, so I had quoted Dr. Crystal Heath. Here, I'll stop sharing my screen now. I had quoted Dr. Crystal Heath earlier in the presentation, who is the executive director of our honor, and they're actually our fiscal sponsor right now. So our work, there is definitely some overlap in our work. Dr. Heath is very focused on the veterinary field as a whole, as a veterinarian. And so there's some overlap in the sense that, people who work in the veterinary field or are going into veterinary medicine oftentimes go into labs. They might be a lab animal vet or do a rotation in a lab. And so there's some overlap there. What our honor is setting out to do is to try to empower the veterinary field to also to basically stand up for all animals. So not just, caring for dogs and cats, but also farmed animals. So there's definitely overlap in that sense that we may come across veterinarians or veterinary students for what we do with Justify. But it's kind of bigger than that. And also there's plenty of veterinarians that don't work in labs. So there's some overlap, which is very relevant, and also we're on our own path in a way as well.
Thank you for explaining that. If people have more questions, please feel free, type them in the chat. And I'm also just going to put a link to NARN's campaign to shut down the Washington National Primate Research Center.
Mm-hmm.
I struggle with the whole name on that. So that is local to Seattle. And they not only have a lab that's totally underground that has hundreds of monkeys, but they have a breeding facility in Arizona. And I have seen reports from there because I do a lot of FOIA requests. And yes, there are mothers that they are impregnated and they give birth and they have their babies taken away, and many of them don't know how to care for them, or are probably so traumatized from having their babies taken that they don't make it. So it's just, this goes on in a lot of places, and it is really horrible. So
Yeah.
Cindy, yes, we're recording it, and we will post it on NARN's YouTube channel. I don't know, Mike, can you put a link to our YouTube channel? If I think I closed it, but I think we might be able to email it out to folks, but that's where we put it.
Yeah, I'll get it. I'll get a link in the chat real quick. Hang on.
Thanks. do folks keep your questions going if you got some other questions?
Quiet audience. Thanks, Sandy. I was excited to see you here.
Yes, Sandy let me know that she's met you.
Yeah, a few years ago.
NARN does have we have a demo tomorrow to let people know about our campaign. We do strive to have our demos be more educational because a lot of people just simply don't know what's going on. You know, like I said, the facility is like literally underground. So I'm just going to put a link to that here. And, you know, in regard to, that's the description and a link to the Facebook event. But, you know, a lot of as Maddie said, a lot of the research done in these places isn't applicable to people. And like the research done at institutions. Oh, Mike, you just sent that to me. A lot of the research done in institutions like the University of Washington and probably Madison they're like just for somebody to publish a paper. You know, like they don't need to be done at all. And given the amount of, as you said, all the amount of money that like NIH, just the NIH
Yes.
gives is so much money. Like the University of Washington in Seattle has received billions of dollars.
Yeah.
And that could be used in so much more effective ways. So if people ask, you know, you as activists, well, what are we going to do if we don't use animals? You can let them know that they don't need to do the research at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and there's also people who are working on non-animal methods, and one of the reasons that it's not progressing at the rate that it could is because the funding is still going so largely to animal research. They need more funding to be able to move things forward with highly promising, you know, things like organs on a chip. So it's, you know, it's all there. Again, there's just this very complicated system that is sort of trying to uphold animal research, and we need to talk about the ways that it's doing that, because it's just, yeah, it's way more complicated, unfortunately, than I think we all want it to be.
Yeah. At one of the previous IACUC meetings, the committee made a really big deal about how they were going to award one person a grant to work on non-animal studies. Like, woo! I mean, the university is a huge place and they have organs on a chip. Like the University of Washington has organs on a chip.
Mm-hmm.
So it's yes.
And it's good. It's good to see that these I mean, I know Madison is doing some of this work too. The thing that's just upsetting is to still see the amount of money being funneled into research with animals, especially like I know at Madison, you know, there was recently they were starting up some studies on female monkeys to look at or to try to induce extreme anxiety into female monkeys, you know, to study extreme anxiety and how that impacts like human women. And it's like, I mean, first of all, these animals, as I stated, are already anxious. So, I mean, maybe that's where you get the extreme anxiety language, but it's just why? I mean, I know so many people who are like, they need therapy. They want, you know, medications. They don't have health insurance. They can't afford it. They can't afford therapy. And so it's like these things that exist that would help the individual, like the target audience, and yet we're still trying to do this to animals. It is crazy making, to say the least.
Yeah. We do have a few examples on the NARN website in the campaign about some of the kind of horrific studies that are done. And it is a lot of stuff like that. For a while, they had the University of Washington had a study where they induced head trauma into baby ferrets to see how to study head trauma.
Yeah.
Like, but there's all kinds of ridiculous protocols. Those are the study designs that occur at the UW. And I'm sure it's like that at a lot of other places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just
Sandy, did Maddie answer your question
Mhm.
about the new legislation to move away from animal testing towards technology? Is that the one that was just recently announced? I think.
I think the FDA moving away, is that what you're talking about? The announcement, like, was that last week?
It was,
Yeah.
yes, it was. I know that there was legislation passed and that now the FDA is finally actually acknowledging
Hmm.
the,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great step forward. It's one of those things where we'll see what happens and see how far it gets, and hopefully, it does what we want it to do. I I I'm I think that like these kinds of things are great, and I also don't think it sort of dismisses the importance of getting industry folks to sort of speak out and share their stories, because at any given point, especially when we've got, whoever in charge of our country, whoever it is at any given time, they might suddenly go, let's go back to animal research. Like, let's do this again. And so I think it's really important that even with good news like that, we're still coming at this issue from multiple avenues, so that it's clear that we shouldn't just suddenly go back because like someone's decided to. Like, no, this is bad for the animals, it's bad for the humans involved. We can do better, if that makes sense. So
yes,
cautiously optimistic, but still, still pushing ahead with Justify. And yes, the zip up sweatshirts are now available on our bonfire, and they're awesome. I'm obsessed. So
that's
they
great.
actually even this is the back. It's got
Oh,
the big logo. Did that I can't actually see.
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah.
Okay,
Or we were
yeah.
able to see it, yeah.
So yeah, if you want to buy a sweatshirt.
I, I've noticed that some of the language they have in those bills too, I'm going to put a link to your website here, about using alternatives to animals. They say if it's equivalent. And the thing I think a lot of like that I've learned anyway is that animal research has been going on for so long, so they have a lot of data. And like, well, this is we know we have all this data to show that animal research supposedly works. I mean, we know that non-human animals are not the same as human animals. So when you introduce a new technology, it's very, very easy to people for like the FDA or some other industry to say, well, you don't have the data. We don't have the data because that hasn't been around as
Right.
long.
And it's not being prioritized
That
with funding.
it's not being used, it's not being prioritized. So they can just say like, oh, well, you said equivalent. We're just going to use the same thing because that's what we have the data on.
Yes. Yeah. No, totally. I just shared our link tree, by the
Oh,
way.
good.
Our website is very bare. I apologize. But our link tree has links to everything, and our website's going to be beautiful soon. So I'm always like, please don't judge me based on the website. Very bare bones right now.
Well, you have a very nice Instagram.
Thanks. We're trying, wearing a lot of hats right now.
Okay, any other questions? I'm not seeing. I just want people to be able to get your questions out.
You can
Thoughts.
always reach out to.
Mhm.
Like I said, if you're interested in learning more, there's Justify. You can also look at the NARN website. It's a campaign we've been working on for quite some time. So it's yeah, if you're interested, you can reach out to either of us.
Amazing. Wow.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your presentation and the work you're doing and educating people. I think it's just a really it's that's far been an unmet need. So yeah, thank you.
I appreciate it. Yeah. And I thank you for sharing your story too. I really appreciated that introduction and hearing where you're coming from too.
Thank you. All right, well, we're gonna let folks go, and unless there's a last minute question, people are just thanking you right now, which is
Yeah.
great. Appreciate that.
Thank
And
you, everyone.
we will post the recording once we get it, once Mike does whatever he needs to do with it. And we'll post it on our YouTube and hopefully send out a link to everybody. So
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.
thank you. I very much appreciate your time and your work.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you. It was
you too.
amazing. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye.